and welcome to the Q&A session of our first webinar entitled Creating Anti-Racist Spaces in Early Childhood. Our panelists are back together. We found that there were so many questions and so many comments in chats that we could not close out without answering some of your questions. So today we're just going to take a peek at the questions and answer to the best of our ability. So thank you for tuning back in, and we're going to jump right in. But before I do that, I'm going to have the panelists each introduce themselves. I am Rosemary Allen, and I am the host of the Let's Talk webinar series for the National Center on Pyramid Model Innovations. Jennifer.
Okay, hi, I'm Jen Neitzel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Educational Equity Institute.
Dorothy.
I'm Dorothy Chaplin. I'm an Assistant Professor of Early Childhood Education at the Metropolitan State University of Denver.
And Iyuma.
Hello, I'm Iyoma Iruka, and I am the Chief Research Innovation Officer at High Scope Education Research Foundation, also known as the Agitator. No.
Well, let's see how this plays out. One of the things you can bet is just like our webinar, this will be lively. It will challenge you to think. It will create some discomfort. And we're hoping, our goal is for you to grow. Once we know better, we must do better. So let's jump in with the first question. So people are focusing on how African Americans in society are full of prejudice and discrimination. But the topic about prejudice and discrimination is more complex than white, Black races. I belong to another minority group in this country, and I and my kids born here are living in the same society with the same issues. What do you say to that?
Well, I'll go ahead and just jump right in and give my thoughts. So I agree, right, that all of us in many ways are experiencing the racialized society, right? And so we all live in that history. And if you're a person of color, you are likely to experience it even more. I would say first and foremost that I think it's important that we understand our history. We have to understand that there's many groups that have been oppressed, right? We can go from the indigenous populations that were pretty much killed off in many ways. Their kids were taken from them and their whole culture almost erased. And still we can see the race and what that meant for their well-being, their health, and even their livelihood. We have, the Japanese internment camp. We have, Mexico. So we have the U.S. has a history of a lot of oppression at such high levels. And then of course we come to, 1619 and the enslavement of Black people. And what I think we should realize is from the history of the U.S. is that while they did a lot of terrible, horrible things to people, the issue of current times is that a lot of the U.S. was built specifically, the way we see it today, was specifically built under an anti-Blackness, right? A lot of it was really policies that ensured that, for example, Black people and poor white people will never, ever come together and challenge the power and the privilege, which is really the slave owners. So I think when we really understand our history, we realize that really, while it is not so dichotomous Black-white, if you understand the history, you realize how much it permeates, not just the relationships we have individually, but the policies that undergirds a lot of things, from the highways to education. A lot of it was really built on anti-Blackness. And so obviously the closer you are to Blackness, whether it be Latino, whether it be somebody who's of color, you're probably going to get a reverberation of some of those effects. And you're probably going to feel oppressed, limited opportunities. But I don't want to sort of, compare who has it worse, because if you're not white, you're probably not going to have it right. But it's important to realize that a lot of the oppression that happens is really much more around anti-Blackness. And then some of that is basically now saying anti-immigrants, xenophobia, and all these things come after that. But the anti-Blackness is kind of that high level where everything starts there and everything else trickles down from there. But we should acknowledge that there's a lot of diversity and differences in terms of oppression. But I would argue, especially as a Black person, that is when you're being killed and murdered on the streets,
right,
and people literally are watching it happen as they drive by, and nobody stops it, when other people of color have also been part of oppressing Black people, then as much as we want to say that, you know, we're all experiencing it at the same time in the same way, I would say for me personally, a bit naive when we could see that is your child being killed or you know, or being oppressed or being policed at 5? Probably not. So I think we have to not try to compare, but also realize the system was created specifically to oppress Black people, and then there's others who get oppressed by it.
Thank you, Yuma.
Great.
I think
And go ahead, Rosemary.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that, you know, what Ayoma is highlighting is the genius of white supremacy, and that, you know, it was specifically set up to keep white landowning men in power. And that has just been passed down generation and generation. And that anti-Blackness, if you're not white, you're included in that category of discrimination and prejudice and those kinds of things. And so I think we have to acknowledge, like Yama is saying, the history of our country and how each of our institutions was set up within that worldview to, you know, advantage one group and oppress another. And so throughout history, as more groups have come into the country who do not have white skin, they've been grouped into that discrimination.
I think too, some of it has to do with colorism, right? And so it's not a black-white thing. It's Black with a capital B is a wide-ranging category of people, and depending on where you stand in terms of your privilege and that white supremacy, depending on where you stand, you can group a lot of people under that category, right? And extend that really far, right? So as a Puerto Rican woman with white passing privilege, right? I have very fair skin. I experience both sides of that in some ways, in some circumstances, but I tend to have that passing privilege, right? And I get afforded a lot more privilege because of what I look like than necessarily others in my own family, right? And others in my community, right? So I think that's part of it, that it isn't strictly black-white. There's this continuum, and we're talking about Blackness in terms of a very wide range. The other thing is when you, as far as in early childhood, when you change things for the most impacted community, everyone benefits, right? So, you know, raises all boats, right? So everybody benefits. If we address one small piece over here for one group of people and one small piece over here for another group of people, we can affect small changes. If we address anti-Blackness in a bigger scope, right? The most impacted community, if we lift that, we lift everybody along the way.
Absolutely. And history has shown that. When you look at the civil rights movement, when you look at Brown versus Board of Education, women's rights, gay rights, Individuals with Disabilities Act, they were all built on that movement. The other thing I want to point out also, as researchers, the most data we have is on that black-white binary. And that's where the comparisons are. And that's where we can see movement. And we haven't had that as much research on other communities of color, unfortunately. So,
and also, like, anytime that we fight something, right? So we take it to court and we go to court, there's someone, right? Brown versus Board of Education. There's someone that's championing that. Some of the cases that have had a huge impact on our ability to teach children who speak multiple languages were not lawsuits that involved Latina communities, right? They were lawsuits that involved Asian Americans, right? And so those lawsuits benefited one group, they benefited multiple groups, right? So this is the same thing. If we're fighting for one group, we're benefiting multiple.
And I think that's something that we should, and I think that's something that we should remember, right? Because part of maintaining the system is that it's actually supposed to pit us against each other, right? So whether it's within the colorism issue, right? Whether it's within the Black group, where it's like who's closer to white, or whether it's within, and remember they tried it with the white people, Italian versus Irish versus, you know, who's a WASP, right? So in many ways, that's actually how the system tries to sort of have you forget how it works, by pitting people of color in particular and those who are marginalized against each other. Because if you actually focus collectively, then you would be like, oh, wait a minute, we have the same people and enemy we should be like really focused on, and not each other. And that's where I think you're right, Dorothy, about how do we sort of hone in on, in the end of it, that yes, we may have unique experiences, right? But in the bigger scheme of things, that if white supremacy is the biggest issue that we have to really address, let's focus in on that, but also address some of our unique experiences and all those kinds of things. But I think you're right. The system literally was built because they were like, white people, do not go with those Black people, because we know you have more power together than separate. So I think we have to remember the history will help guide us in some ways if we heard it, listen to it, and remember it. But then they don't teach us history either.
Absolutely. And for those of you who'd like to know more about what Yuma is talking about, just Google Bacon's Rebellion. And that will give you wonderful information about how Black enslaved Africans partner with poor whites in terms of fighting against the system, which were the very few slave owners. So that will give you some good information. And that leads me to a question that we've decided not to answer, and that is, can you provide us with resources, or where are resources? We want you to be empowered to educate yourself. If you Google anti-racist resources, racial equity resources, you will find a plethora of information. So we're going to allow you to do that. There was another question, and I really want you all to think about this when I talk about the historical aspects as well. It says, are we going to tackle the lack of African-American teachers in early childhood classrooms in which the children are mostly African-American? So I'm going to ask you to think about the history, what happened right after Brown versus Board of Education. And I also want you to talk about the hierarchy in terms of African-American teachers and institutions that claim to be equitable, are interested in diversity, and what happens at the top. Are we seeing African-Americans at the top in administrative positions as well? All right, jump right in.
Right, and I think that, you know, for this question in particular, it also varies between childcare and, you know, Head Start and pre-K teachers. And so when you think about who has the lowest paying jobs, it's the childcare providers, who tend to be mostly Black women. And so that's something that needs to be addressed. And also when you're thinking about, like you were talking about the who's in leadership positions, I remember several years ago when I was putting together a proposal for the QRAS conference, and they had a mandatory thing that you had to have, you know, a person of color in the presentation. And so this presentation had to have people in leadership positions. And it was very hard for me to find through my network a Black person who was in a leadership position that could address the issues. And I think that, you know, when we're looking at equity and in early childhood education, that goes beyond the classroom, and we really need to be putting more people of color, particularly Black women, in positions of power to influence policy and practice, so that some of these issues that we're talking about in terms of Black teachers not, particularly in Head Start and pre-K classrooms, not representing the population that they're serving, that needs to be addressed.
Thank you.
And I would say this, right? Like, and I think, Jen, you said it, and I now expand on it as saying, it's not Black teachers are not just for Black kids, right? Black teachers are for a whole bunch of, like, I feel like there should be more kids who experience a Black teacher, right? Like there's an energy, there's a vibe, there's just, when I talk about Black teachers, I just get a smile on my face, because I feel like everybody should experience a Black teacher. So I think that Black children should get Black teachers. But I also think that, white children, Latino children, they just should get a Black teacher and cross-racial teachers. So I feel like, I think that's important, right? Because when I think about all the work now focusing on, let's diversify the field, both early child is better, I would say, than K to 12 or pre-K to 12 in the school system. It's a little better. But when you hear these conversations, like, well, we got to help these poor little Black and brown kids. They need to see the teachers. And I'm like, well, yeah, but we shouldn't position in a way that only you all can teach your kids because we can't. And my argument is no, I think we need, and that's where research needs to do better is, is not to always have this narrative about Black teachers for Black kids and Latino teachers for Latino kids, but is we need to begin to show the value and the unique perspectives that Black teachers bring into the classroom, into the way of being and thinking. So that's one. The second thing is, I think you alluded to this, Rosemary, is that the whole desegregation law was desegregation. It was never integration. And when that happened, all the teachers that were brilliant did not have a job, right? So even in that sector, they literally got rid of you. And so while I definitely always credit early childhood for having a bit more of Black people and people of color in the teaching position, like Jen said, they're always at the sort of the lower level, or they're the discipline police, or they're the cook. They do everything but be the educational leader in many ways. And so I think in many ways, and then I think our standards is starting to create this sort of other level of, while they don't call it desegregation, but in some ways, like, if you don't meet the standard of what it is to be a teacher, which is, do you have your degree? Have you gone through all the PDs? Does the class measure or the ERS measure, the environment rating scale measures, do they say that you're a good teacher? If it doesn't, we'll have to get rid of you. So in some ways, I don't want to blame certain people or certain things, but when you start creating systems under this guise of, we're trying to make sure that all kids have access to high quality, but then you use certain tools that in some ways bifurcates the system that says, you teacher are horrible, you teacher are good, that in itself is a de facto segregation system. And then it positions Black teachers to not be able to be, in schools, particularly in pre-K and all these other places, because they're not meeting the standards set by all these accountability systems. So I feel like there's so much that we can do and say about what do we do about Black teachers, about Black leaders. But I feel like at the same time, people have to accept Black people. Like, if you don't like Black people, why would you want them to be leaders of your system, right? So it goes back to the issue of anti-Blackness, right? People they may want to see your face to feel better, but do they want to really hear your voice? And I do think that this is a moment where we could do more about how do we elevate voices that we have in some ways silenced. And I'm hoping that through, this opportunity of talking with all of you, that we can elevate those voices that, in some ways the civil rights movement happened and we just floated on by. And now all of our Black leaders are kind of like, it's time for me to retire. And I'm like, but wait, we have a whole vacuum. Like, all of us can't sit in the same, like, there's a vacuum literally. And I'm like, what do we do to create that vacuum? It now means that white women in particular and white men are going to have to, in some ways, challenge the uncomfortability to elevate Black people and obviously elevate Latinos and other indigenous populations. And that in itself is not us. I think we almost don't have a choice but to wait till somebody says, we have chosen you. And then we extend. But I think that this is an opportunity for us to really say, what is the value of Black people? And then you will see the value of a Black leader, a Black teacher, etc.
Right, and like with Black leadership too, it's like, white people are going to have to realize that they shouldn't have the answers, and that they're not the ones who should be responsible for guiding this work forward. And so it's really essential that we do lift the voices of people of color, because and that's going to be really hard for some white people in leadership positions, because it means letting go of some semblance of power.
One of the things is that the benefit of Black teachers to white children. I have a concern that so many white children go their entire academic careers without having any Black teacher. And the only interaction they get with Black people is in a position to serve them, as the bus driver, as the cafeteria worker, as the front office person. And I think that creates this, the foundation for some of the white supremacy. So by the time they run into a person of color, especially an African-American person, in a position of power, they have no idea what to do with it. And the world is upside down and it can be perceived as a threat. So I think that's one of the greatest one of the worst outcomes for not having a Black teacher is that you do not ever get to see Black people in a position of authority. Dorothy, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say that, you know, we have to look at the history. We have to acknowledge the fact that we wanted to integrate schools in order to get children, Black and brown children who were in bad schools, into good schools. And we defined bad schools as the ones that were taught by African-American women and good schools as the ones that were taught by white women. And so that set up a system where we were getting rid of the bad teachers and the bad schools in favor of the good schools. So we set up an entire system where white equals better as far as teachers go and teacher quality. And now all of a sudden we're in a position where we're saying, oh, gee, we need more diversity in teaching. Who's raising their hand like, oh, wait, let me be the first. Let me run out there and get into those positions. And we know that in the entire school system across the country, right? Looking at the whole school system, 80% of teachers are white, right? Across the system. When we look at the early childhood world, we're talking about 40 to 50%, depending on Head Start, different things. 40, 50% are people of color, right? So we're better at it than the rest of the school system, but we're still talking about the lowest paid, lowest prestige position in all of education is an early childhood teacher or assistant, right? And that's where you find all this rich diversity. So how do we elevate people and help people move through that system when we know we have a system that I'm teacher in a classroom for many, many years. I have an assistant who happens to be male, white male, in my classroom who I'm training with my years of expertise, right? I'm his master teacher. He's my student. And administration comes in to look at this wonderful build your own model program. And the first thing they do is say, have you thought about going into admin? To him, not to me, right? Because that's who we elevate and that's who we move up. And those are the things that we have to change, right? We bring our own up, right? So if our administration is white males, who are they looking to come and fill their shoes and for succession planning and all of that? They're not looking at brown women, right? They're not looking at Black women in the classroom, preschool teachers. That's not who we're considering. So those are the things that we have to address in order to change that. We can't just say, you know, these children need more teachers of color. We have to address the fact that we're not creating systems that invite and support and value and recognize what Black teachers bring.
And Dorothy, you bring up a very good point in terms of the systems. Let's talk a little bit about the higher ed system. It's one thing to support teachers and elevate them once they're there, but what happens or does not happen in higher ed where we can't get teachers there? What are some of the barriers?
We can't teachers into teacher programs or
into teacher programs or completing teacher programs or licensure versus non-licensure, things like that.
Well, licensure is a huge issue because in Colorado and in most states, you can't achieve licensure without student teaching. And what is student teaching? Student teaching is a semester or residency, a full year, where you are paying for college credits and you are working full-time for free. And that means you have to give up your job in order to do this semester or year, depending on the program, right? This is a wonderful initiative in Colorado to have residency for all these different programs because a full year is better, more like an internship and more like more quality in the field training. All of those are great in theory, but in practice, what it means is I have to quit my job as a preschool teacher, right? Where I'm already working and already getting paid. In order to get that license, you have to quit that job and go and spend a semester or a year under someone else's tutelage to become better at what I'm doing so that I can get that license. And who is it that can afford that? And who is it that can't afford the time and the finances? And that has a huge impact on how many of our teachers end up stuck, right? Stuck in early childhood. They're not able to rise up into those other systems that pay better, not because those systems are inherently better systems, but because they pay better, right? There's better pay and there's more opportunity for growth maybe in some of those fields than our early childhood system has been able to afford them. So I think that's a big part of what we see in early childhood. The time that it takes to train, to take all those classes, to get those licenses, to get those degrees, when you can go out in the field and start a childcare center, right? And get licensed without having all of that, get your center licensed without having licensure yourself.
You know, if there's a system of any kind, you know who, I mean, I could close my eyes and be like, oh, who's going to be mostly impacted? Oh, I got it. The Black and brown people, right? Or poor people, right? It's almost like, so literally look at it. The fact that what is the rationale of having to have a residency when, wait, I'm already doing the work. Like I probably have way more experience than your faculty members, but I have to prove that I can do the work. And so this is almost like where it doesn't even make sense. And there's not even evidence that it makes sense, but we continue to do it because in many ways, it basically says we're going to find a way to systematically and legally basically say who can enter through the door and who cannot, right? Because as a school teacher, you have access to, depending on where you are, unions, which means you can do nothing. You know, it's almost like tenure faculty. You know what? I'm done working. I'm going home. You can't fire me, right? You have access to pension, to healthcare, things that make your life easy, that the daily hassles are easy because you have this full system behind you and somebody else is fighting for you that you don't have to really fight for. And why would we have a system be so easy for people to come into? And so anything that in some ways privileges, right? You know who's not going to necessarily benefit from it. And that's if you're able to get into college, right? So even if we I mean, if you just keep walking your way backwards, you'll begin to see that even to make it through high school, make it into college. I mean, mind you that the wealth of Black and brown people, what is it, about $8,000 compared to $114,000 for white people? So even that notion of wealth and asset doesn't even make sense. We have the whole issue with the education loans and where, you know, these for-profit colleges were saying, oh, we're going to be able to get you a job, et cetera. Who was most likely to be penalized was really actually Black people who were basically, people were coming after them to come enter these because education is going to free you. Now you're literally in debt and you can't even use that degree. So in many ways, I think that we have to begin to unwind the ugliness of racism and how it continues to boil Black people and other people of color in places and spaces that it's like, you told me to go to graduate high school, I did that. You told me to go to college, I did that. You told me to go get this degree, I did that. But I'm still making 63 cents for every dollar. It's like you keep telling me to keep doing all these things, but I'm still feeling oppressed. I still feel burnt out. I'm not even valued. And so it's almost like, why do we keep lying to people of color and Black people that you should continue to jump these obstacles when you jump it? Is like, you're not getting the benefit. There is no a white high school person will make way more money than a Black person with a master's degree, right? Like, and so it's almost like, why keep telling us to go get all these great things when we never actually benefit from it? And so in some ways, I wish we'll stop lying to people. Go get a license, go get a college degree, go, like, yes, I have all those things. And yes, I probably am benefiting, but it's like, is it at the same level when it's on an average, when as a system, it's always positioned that even if when you meet those goals that they put for you, you may never actually benefit off of that in the same way, in the same level. And I think that's just unfair. And so that means that for young children, we tell all these people, go get a degree, you know, and like the whole new, you know, get a degree to transform the workforce stuff. Yeah, but how do I pay that loan, or how do I pay that if I'm still making $10 an hour? Like, how do I explain that? Like, how do I, and what, I can't do that in California. I can't live on $10 an hour, right? Like, so I think we just have to be realistic about, yes, I want an educated workforce. I want all of that stuff. But I'm not going to go tell somebody from my community to go get that degree and to go be in that profession if I know literally you're not going to get the position or the money. And so I'm just basically creating a indentured servitude. And in many ways, like, for example, we have, you know, whether teacher wages is like, you get your degree, we'll pay for it. However, you must give us 2 to 3 years of your life. Why? I've already given you a lot of my whole entire wealth. Why should I give you even more time for me to work for free, or not for free, but pretty much for free, because you're creating a system of indentured. And I think that's, and why are we doing that? Why are we forcing people who are already not going to benefit the most to stay in a program because you paid, you know, $5,000? I don't know if that's the best way we should go.
Thank you, Huma. Did you want to add anything to that, Jen?
Well, yeah, I was, you know, as Ioma was talking, I was thinking about how, like, you know, the systems of oppression that we have created in this country that are based on false narratives. And, you know, just thinking about, yes, we want an educated workforce, but like Ioma was saying, like, these people, a lot of people without degrees are really good teachers and have more experience than these, you know, white students are coming out with a 4-year diploma. And there's an aspect of lived experience that I think is incredibly important in all of this work. And so the people with the lived experience have to be a part of restructuring the system. They have to. We have to lift their voices, because otherwise we're just perpetuating the status quo.
Thank you. We have another question. Is the accreditation from NAEYC racist? Is it considered racist? And I think this came from a lot of our discussion around normative behaviors and who decides what's normative, about high quality programs and who decides what's high quality. It came about as a result of discussing the historical roots of early childhood in a deficit model based on racism, that these children were deficit and they needed to, and broken, and they needed to be fixed. But this is a good question. And I think we should really kind of think deeply about it and just kind of go there, even if we have to offer recommendations.
Right, and I think that, you know, I think this is going to be a hard one for the field. Yes. Because, you know, the standards that we have and the accreditation processes that we have are so ingrained within early childhood education. But if we're looking at and really reflecting on who created the system, who created the accreditation, who decided what was high quality, and thinking about, you know, what interactions should look like. You know, when you look at the research on teacher-child interactions or teacher-child relationships, and that, you know, Black children have less quality, lower quality relationships with white teachers, and it's so even if you have these rating scales that show, like, this is what teacher-child interactions should look like, you know, thinking about, okay, what does that actually look like in practice, and what does it look like for which children? And so to really dig deep into equity efforts in early childhood education, we're going to have to examine everything: child assessments, environmental assessments, accreditation, you know, how we receive ratings within states, what state pre-K programs look like, what Head Start programs look like, and we're really going to have to push through a reasonable, I would say a considerable amount of discomfort and probably defensiveness to work through these issues to create a more equitable system.
And I think too, we have to acknowledge that that if all of our systems, right, are centered on whiteness and are grounded in whiteness, and that's historically what we have in this country, it doesn't matter what piece you pull out of that. It came up in a system that is designed to center some and devalue others. And because that's the way the system works, when we look at it and we say, okay, so we're going to create this, whether it's assessment of children or anything, right? We're going to say, so what's typical and normal for children at this age level, right? We're going to look at assessment, observation and assessment. We're going to observe objectively what these children are doing. Then we're going to compare them to this normed group that may or may not include everyone, but is definitely valuing certain things over others and ranking certain things over others. That system is not designed to be racist, but it was designed within a racist system, within a racist society that centers on whiteness. So the norm that we're looking for, what we're calling the typical and what we should be seeing in any circumstance, is grounded in this system. So it doesn't matter whether you say, is this assessment racist? Is that program, is that curriculum, right? Any one of those things that you pick apart, if you look at where it came from, it's grounded in a society that has a certain value system, and that value system highlights some and diminishes others. And so, yes, every one of them, all of them, they're all racist. In some way, shape, or form, they're all racist because of what they come from and where they started. And so that's the work that we have to do. That's the work that has to be tackled. It's not easy work. It's not small work. It's not little steps. It's not holding a sign or posting a thing on your social media. It's not reading a book. It's really digging in and looking at, where did this come from? How did it evolve? And what if I looked at it from a different light? What if I centered on someone else for this? What would typical, normal, average, widely held expectation be, right? Who's that widely held expectation really about? And if I started somewhere else, what would it look like? And that's the way that we have to dismantle every one of these pieces, one at a time and all at once.
Ooh, I'm so glad that Jen and Dorothy went first, right? So I felt like, ooh, thank God for the cover. But my face probably said everything. I try to hide my face. Rosemary, I feel like remember what you said, when we were together in the live webcast, is that you are either anti-racist or you're racist. And I think that's what Dory said, there is no middle for you here, right? You can't be like, oh, I'm here in the middle, I'm a moderate. Nope, you got to pick a lane. And I think that's, while we can give credit potentially to NAYC on, like, you try to create a whole accreditation system to really meet the needs of different providers, educators in different spaces, so that one is not privileged. You try to be thoughtful, but I think and I would say, over time they've tried to sort of strengthen their language, but I think Dorothy and Jen, you were right? If you're not calling it, right, if you're silent on racism, if you're silent on white privilege, if you're silent on that, all you are is complicit, right? So I think that's the whole point, is that while we can say, we know we're trying to champion the folks without power in many ways, but if you interrogate every aspect of everything you've done, you may fall under you are racist category. So in many ways, you have to almost dismantle it and give power to those where it really started, and say, hey, those of color, aka Black people particularly, let me look at everything from your vantage point. You should own this space, right? I remember when NAYC and NBCDI, NAYC and the National Black Child Development Institute decided to hold a meeting together. And I thought, oh my goodness, we're about to have an awakening moment. And I remember in that time, a comfortability of the white majority audience, right? Because part of the NBCDI, the National Black Child Development Institute, is that it's really centered on African-centered ways of being, from the elders up in the room to a lot of like sort of spiritual guidance, right? There's a lot about your ancestor that really drives you, and the way that you come to the world and the way you present yourself is not about you, it's about your community. And so there's this level of communalism that tends to happen. And I remember that time when it came together, and I was like, I know it's supposed to be together, but it felt really separate. And I wondered if it was because here you are, this white majority, really white-led organization, trying to do what I thought was a beginning of, we're going to recenter ourselves around Black people, and because they were part of the beginnings of us. And so I thought that would continue, but I've always wanted to ask, why didn't it not continue, right? Is it that it didn't go the way you wanted, that your members are like, I'm not going to do this again because I felt really uncomfortable having to sort of go through the ways. It's almost like going to church with Black people, right? There's ways that we worship, right? That people have never ever experienced. And so it seems like, oh my God. And I wonder in that same way whether that's what happened. So I guess in many ways, that experience says that, this is the opportunity for NAYC to really maybe rethink how do you really embrace issues of race, you know, being anti-racist, right? It's not enough to just say we believe in diversity, equity, inclusion, which I kind of hate those languages now, but we believe in that, is good. But if you're not talking about anti-racism and white privilege and white supremacy, that means that you have a lot more work to do, because all you're doing is sort of hide it in that space of we are good, we are kind, we love children, but you're not really focusing on how are we part of dismantling the system that we help to upkeep on many, many levels. Again, like I said, people say, you know, we have good intentions. Good intentions probably started slavery too. So I think in that way, we should all remember that.
Right. And can I just say one more thing about that? Because I think the other thing that we also have to consider is that the entire educational system, every aspect, all the structures within the educational system were set up for white children. And we keep trying to force Black children into this system that was not set up for them. And so, like Ioma and Dorothy both said, it's time to dismantle those structures and rebuild new ones.
Oh, and want to say, and thank you, Jay, because you know, I had this one note in my thing where people are like, oh my God, COVID-19, all the losses the kids are gonna have. And I think Dorothy, you sort of made mention of it. And not for me, that I remember that. I'm like, yeah, why are we all panicking? The kids are with their family. You know, the kids are learning in the space that's so comfortable to them. I mean, there's like this huge panic. Oh, you mean the kids are not gonna learn the white way of being? That means probably for a whole year, the kids are going to be with their community and their family, and they're going to learn things. They're going to learn different languages, different ways of speaking, being. And I'm like, oh, that's why everybody is scared about the losses. You know what I mean? Because they're not going to learn to do what exactly, right? Because they're with their family, they're going to just veg out in front of a television, really? And kids learn not just by you talking to them, but by the experience they're having. And I don't know what family people go to, but you know, there's always experiences happening in people's families, right? That transmit information and beliefs and traditions, and in many ways, excellence, right? So I feel like that's a part of where I'm like, yeah, this whole panic tizzy about, oh my God, all the losses, like, yeah, they may lose a couple of points on the, you know, PBVT, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, but trust me, they learn a whole lot of language about how to be centered in who you are and not to be traumatized by the system that keeps traumatizing you. So I think people should shift and see what is it that kids are gaining. Like I think about my 3-year-old son, and me and my husband were worried about, oh my goodness, he's gonna not have anything. And here he is, like just speaking and showing his mind in literally a month. And I'm like, wow. Like, right, and here I'm a developmental psychologist. Of course I knew he was gonna grow, but we're not doing we're not doing a whole lot. I hate to say it that way, but to see his growth, and that's because the experiences he's having with his sister, me and his father, like all of that that's happening is such a deep level of growth. And I think we should begin to sort of switch how we're looking at COVID-19. Like, yes, there's a lot of trauma happening, but it's also a lot of bonding and a lot of discourse and connections and attachments and relationships being strengthened. You know, like a story came out about, you know, fathers and Black fathers and how they're taking this moment to really, I think in some ways, unwind, right? And really say, you know what, I need to be here for my children because now I have the moment, even if I'm unemployed or whatever, I have the moment to be with them. And so I think, Jen, to, you know, your point about we have to begin to interrogate what is it that we want out of these systems, and do we keep privileging the white way of being as the only way? And if we're not drinking the Kool-Aid every day, ooh, they're like, what's gonna happen? You are gonna come back, we have to fix you again, right? And I think to me sometimes that is the fear. We're gonna have to fix y'all again.
I am loving this conversation, and it's so much more than question and answer segment, but I do want to bring it down to the classroom level. There are some people watching who's saying, okay, but what can I do in my classroom? So this last question I want us to answer is, how can we design rules, expectations, a classroom that are deliberately anti-racist? Well, while you all are thinking, I got this wonderful book, Don't Look Away, and it is, the author is Ioma Iruka with her colleagues, and it is definitely a game changer. I have started incorporating a lot of the strategies into my own work, into webinars. I've had 4 since our last meeting where I use some of the strategies here, everyday things you could do in the classroom, and considerations, things you should look out for, because not only are you creating an anti-racist classroom, but you are also making sure that there are no racist elements there. So why don't you all each talk about that a little bit before we wrap up?
So I want to say one thing that we give a lot of lip service to, I think, in education and all levels, and that we don't really do. So we talk about including parents and inviting parents and getting parents engaged in the classroom. And right now we are at this moment in time where like we're talking about these kids who are home, right? Who are with their families. And we know that for some children, that is not a good situation. But for many, many children, right? They're exposed to all of these wonderful, rich things. They are growing, they are learning in an environment where they're comfortable. We have a moment and an opportunity now as children come back, whatever that looks like, 10 children with masks, whatever it looks like. As children start coming back, we have this opportunity to just ask families, what is it that you value in this time that you've had with your children? What is it that you've seen benefit your child? Where have you seen your child be successful? Instead of saying, these are the gaps and holes that we're anticipating because we weren't continuing to teach your child these things, so we got to fix this, to stop and step back and say, what is it that you've seen that's beneficial, and how do I build on that? And in that way, we establish our rules and our expectations in the classroom, not from my background and my value system and what I think is acceptable behavior, right? But from what's really worked for your child, and really start from there. What has worked for your child? How do I bring more of that to my classroom? How do we establish ways of being in our classroom that honor that?
Right, and I agree, Dorothy. I think we do need to get to know our families better and beyond a superficial level, so that we can have a greater understanding of, family life and community life, so we can incorporate those elements into the classroom. And I think that one of the biggest things is that there are a couple of things that I see when I think about an anti-bias, anti-racist classroom, is that, it's that the cultural backgrounds and the families of the children are included in every aspect of learning. And so it's not just this, Black History Month unit or those kinds of things, but they're really incorporating elements of the children's culture and their experiences in their daily lives and into every activity. And, another element is the level of democracy and community building that can take place within an anti-racist classroom, and really engaging the children in creating the rules for the classroom in very simple language, and getting them to see, what do they think that the rules of the classroom should be, instead of the teacher dictating it from a white European viewpoint. And and along with the community building, just creating a lot of opportunities, because our society is so segregated. It's the most segregated it's ever been, but it's increasingly diverse. And by 2040, I think it is, that white people are going to be in the minority in this country. And so, not only do Black children and children of color, they need to feel welcomed and be a part of the classroom, we also have to create opportunities for our white children to navigate an increasingly diverse world in a way where they're not in charge. They don't have all the answers. And then they're working towards social justice as well. And we can do that in an early childhood classroom in a developmentally appropriate way. And so those are the things that I think about in an anti-racist classroom.
So I'll say first, I just learned so much from Dorothy and Jen. And of course, thank you so much, Rosemary, for raising up and making visible the book that I co-wrote with 3 other phenomenal Black women from the diaspora. I'll just quickly say, so there's Stephanie Currington at Boston University, there's Tanya Jordan at Georgia State, and then there's Carrie Ann Eskai at University of Nebraska, Omaha. And I feel like we sort of represent the Black diaspora. So I use Black a lot. I actually don't use African American a lot, because even though African American signifies, you have a history to a more direct line to enslavement. If you're Black, there's a lot of things you experience, regardless of whether you're from your lineage quote unquote starts here or starts somewhere in the diaspora. So I want to sort of raise up them and what they do, and just having the four of us come together and form this community. And I would say for the anti-racist classroom to really be in existence, we have to challenge both sides of the coin, of both the white privilege side of the coin as well as the anti-blackness side of the coin, right? So that means we have to look at, who's being included or excluded. I've gone into a lot of high quality 5-star programs, right? And then come to see that, again, not the fault of the teacher, but the time they spend with certain groups of children, the kind of language they're having, the kind of relationships that's being garnered. So what kind of interactions are you really having that says the way you think your life is important to me, and not and what does that tell other people? Look at the kind of toys and materials you have in the classroom, right? How much does it really represent children in many ways? Are we still saying, hey, the only toys that are there are those that look white or close to white, that have a certain kind of hair, right? So think about it, not just the racial part of things, but also the gender part, right? Where certain girls are told what's pretty and what's not pretty, what size you should be, what your hip size should be, right? So it's thinking through the lens of both racial and also the intersectionality of gender as well. And think about observing children, right? The beautiful thing about certain approaches is how it's not about trying to quote unquote fix children as we've articulated, but how do we observe children and the messages that either we're sending to them that then they repeat, like messages about who gets to be in power, who is the teacher, who is the doctor versus who's the taxi driver, right? Like, so we need to pay attention to what is the messages we're sending, and how do both our books, our homes, our classrooms, continue to foster who gets to be the leader and who gets to be the follower, right? A lot of times we think about quote unquote the Indian in chief, that's what we look for, but we never look for who gets to be positioned at a higher level. So looking at how children interact with each other during some of those times, I think is important. And also look at the anti-blackness, right? Do we see that, that certain children are like, they may not say the words, but their behavior says who I'd rather. And teachers in many ways can be the conduit, right? To create a space for children to be able to play across racial groups, right? People, I talk to a lot of white parents who are like, oh my God, I can't talk about race to my kids. And I'm like, well, you may not, but they are, right? They're just making their own interpretation of it. And so teachers in some ways could be the avenue through where some of these conversations about race can come into play. And by letting children, why do we let a 4 or 5-year-old make decisions or say, this is what race, or this is what I should be doing, and interpret all these messages that they're getting that they can't really fully comprehend? And so what we should be thinking about as educators of the classroom is, how do we create the space to talk about fairness, to talk about equity, to challenge each other, should you get more than one? Should he or she get more than one? So I think we have to begin to create the spaces where children actually have the autonomy to challenge. And not only certain kids in the classroom have the space to challenge, right? The reason why we have a level of disproportionality in suspension and expulsion is not because kids are, 48-month-old and 60-month-olds are sort of like just wild and crazy. Is that sometimes those who challenge us are viewed as, you're either precocious or you are just causing trouble and giving me hell and you're oppositional, right? So, and again, it's how do we interact and create spaces that is safe, that is warm, but also recognize that, the beauty of race, right? Like the beauty of who we are, why we may be humans. Like people always say, we're humans. That's true. But it's also experiences that make us who we are. So by being able to acknowledge to children that we are all different, but we also have some similarities, I think could go a long way to just open up the classroom and to recognize it's okay to recognize color. It's actually, you're supposed to, because we have crayon boxes. And I think being able to foster those languages, give children language, give them space, do readings around it, have conversations around it, I think are really important. And also position children of color not as the bad guys, right? But position them in a place of leadership, of sharing their knowledge and their history. And I think, Dorothy, to your point, also bringing families in. So there's not only the families who have time to come share their stories, but how do we also use technology now, right? They could have been appearing by webinar forever, FaceTime, right? But we kind of said, you have to come to the classroom to show us and tell us who you are. But I'm hoping that this COVID-19 could help reshape how we value the contribution of many members of a classroom. And we can now make it even much more possible through webinar, through FaceTime, et cetera. So I think that there's many ways to do that, but we have to also look at what is the language, the interactions, and also visually, what are we showing kids? What's on the walls, right? What are all those things?
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you, our panelists, for this amazing Q&A session. I just want to remind people about what an anti-racist is. When we think about being an anti-racist, it is a person who is actively fighting against the policies, practices, laws, behavior, and ideas of racism. That you can't be neutral, that racism is, and either you're fighting against it as an anti-racist, or you are a racist, a passive racist or an active racist. Racism isn't who you are, but it's what you do or what you fail to do. We all have the responsibility to create safe, nurturing environments for all children that are free of racism. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to hearing your comments in the comment section. Thank you.